It's great to be here today. So another kind of long title. Today I'll be talking about intonational categories and implicit speech rate normalization, which I will suggest kind of points to some awareness of prosody in rate-dependent speech perception. So as a bit of background, we know well that the phonetic realization of speech sounds varies systematically as a function of prosodic position. One kind of well-documented case of this is initial strengthening, with a kind of classic example being with voice onset time, where VOT is robustly longer at the beginning of an intonational phrase as compared to IP medially. Now, another source of variability in the speech signal that listeners are going to have to contend with is along the dimension of speech rate. So again, taking VOT as an example, slower speaking rates would equate to generally longer VOT in production, and perceptually, we know listeners are very sensitive to this sort of thing, adjusting their categorization of durational contrasts on the basis of changes in speech rate, either proximal to the target or at more of a distance. So this is something that's been called implicit speech rate normalization in the literature, and I'll be kind of discussing it a bit today. So given these observations, the extent to which listeners are sensitive to prosodically driven variability in the speech signal perceptually remains an open question, and I'll get into exactly what I mean by that in a second. So one past study that addressed this, which I'll be referencing, is Kim and Cho 2013. They had listeners categorize a VOT continuum as one of two target words, pa or ba. And the crucial manipulation here is the implied prosodic position of that target sound within the carrier phrase in the stimuli. So as shown here, in the medial condition in 1, the target is medial to a single intonational phrase. Let's hear X again, where X is the target. And crucially, in the initial condition, it is IP initial being preceded by a phrase boundary following the word here. And in this particular case, it's marked by a phrase final lengthening and a low boundary tone. So the author's kind of crucial question is, will listeners' awareness of or expectation of initial strengthening in IP initial position influence the way that they categorize this VOT continuum? So specifically, will listeners require longer VOT for a P response in the initial condition, reflecting some sort of sensitivity to the fact that VOT is longer IP initially? So this is indeed what the authors find. This is taken directly from their own data. We have a categorization plot. We'll be seeing a few of these today, so I'll just kind of point out the key features. Here you have VOT values on the x-axis and %P responses on the y-axis. So we see, of course, as we'd expect in this kind of perception experiment, as VOT increases, P responses increase. This is typical. Crucial point here is that we get a significant effect of position, whereby overall, in the initial position, listeners require longer VOT for a P response. What this looks like visually is a kind of rightward pulling of the categorization line on the function, and we can also think of this as an effective decrease in P responses, kind of in terms of area under the curve of each line. So this is interesting. The authors analyze it as originating from perceptual sensitivity and kind of consequent compensation for initial strengthening. Now, interestingly, the same effect could also be analyzed simply as kind of run-of-the-mill speech rate normalization. So this is a reanalysis proposed by Mitter, Cho, and Kim in 2016, who note that in creating these different positional manipulations, duration was kind of necessarily also covariate. So specifically, in the initial condition, the target was preceded by a boundary marked by lengthening, and therefore the sound preceding it was longer as compared to the medial condition. And this sort of durational difference alone is something we would expect to shift categorization actually in precisely the same way. So this is well documented in many other experiments with VOT. And as Mitter et al. Point out, in this particular case, both these explanations predict the exact same shift in categorization. So in that sense, from a kind of theoretical standpoint, it remains a very open question the extent to which listeners might be sensitive to prosodically conditioned variability in the way that they perceive speech segments. So today I'll be trying to get at this from a kind of a different angle, asking how intonation might independently influence categorization. What this will look like in terms of methodology, kind of more concretely, is manipulating intonational cues to prosodic structure while holding duration constant. I'll get into this a bit more in a second. So I'll be talking about two experiments today. The first, kind of to go into the details about the design, is following what Kim and Cho did, a simple forced choice task. Listeners hear a sound from a VOT continuum and categorize it as pa or ba. That sound is in a carrier phrase, and the crucial manipulations here are 2 by 2 of pitch and duration of the vowel in the word say in the carrier phrase all say X again, where X is the target sound. So the 2 by 2 manipulations are shown here in the table. You can see 2 duration conditions, long and short, crossed with 2 intonation conditions, what I'm calling the flat condition, which is highish flat F0, and the low-high condition, which is low-rising F0. We'll see pitch tracks of these in just a second. So 2 by 2 crossed to create these 4 separate conditions, all on the preceding vowel before the target sound. So yes, here we have pitch tracks. The long conditions at top, short at bottom. You'll note, of course, everything in the carrier phrase besides that manipulated vowel is the same. And also of note, within a given intonational condition, the pitch values are the same. It's just their distribution over time, which is manipulated. So just to give you an idea of what these manipulations actually look like. Now you may be wondering why these were chosen as variables. Their selection was informed by the interpretations predicted listeners might have in reference to intonational categories as defined in autosegmental metrical approaches to mainstream American English intonational phonology. So specifically, it was predicted that in the long condition, both contours should be acceptable boundary tones, what we might transcribe as H minus L percent and L minus H percent for the flat and low-high condition respectively. But crucially, in the short condition, there's a predicted asymmetry in interpretation. This is, the flat contour when compressed should be interpreted not as any sort of boundary, but simply as a transition between adjacent pitch accents. And in contrast, the low-high contour when compressed should, in theory, sound persistently to some extent like a boundary tone to listeners. This is for 2 reasons. One, in the creation of the stimuli, which I haven't gone into any detail about, this was actually originally produced full on as L minus H percent, so in one sense it literally is a boundary tone. And otherwise, for kind of theoretical reasons, a single non-prominent syllable with this type of pitch movement and 2 distinct tonal targets lined in this way is something that we think is likely to be interpreted by listeners as a boundary tone, L minus H percent. So if this is correct, we're expecting effective intonation in the short condition only. This is critical. As far as what this might be, if listeners perceive some sort of intonational cue to boundary and compensate for upcoming post-boundary lengthening of VOT, we might expect to see something like this pattern of results here. So this is just a schematic plot, not actual data. You can see the 2 short conditions, short, low, high, and short, flat, plotted together, and we're seeing a rightward shift that is to higher VOT values in the low, high condition, reflecting the fact that listeners are, in theory, perceptually expecting longer VOT and therefore compensating in categorization. So also we can think of this as decreased P responses. Now we can contrast this prediction with what speech rate normalization would predict. Here, of course, because this is in the short condition only, duration is the same across the carrier phrase, and for that simple reason, we'd predict no shift whatsoever on the basis of contextual duration between these 2 conditions. So in that sense, we can kind of try to compete these 2 hypotheses and see what the results look like. Okay, a little bit about the procedure. Here, 50 self-reported monolingual American English-speaking adults participated. All of them were students at UCLA and they received course credit for participating. They were tested in the lab and similarly were randomized, not blocked by any particular condition. As far as the stats, this was done using mixed effects logistic regression. Okay, jumping right into the results. First, I want to note kind of the effective duration that came out, ignoring intonation for a moment. So here we have another categorization plot, VOT values again on the x-axis, percent P responses on the y-axis, and this time categorization split by just duration condition, ignoring intonation. So we see, first of all, a main effective duration whereby overall the longer preceding vowel is decreasing P responses. This is kind of uninformative and peripheral to the central question, but entirely expected as kind of typical speech rate normalization. If you'll think back to the Kim and Cho plot, the same kind of analogous effect emerged. So kind of uninteresting, but perhaps reassuring to see that listeners are interpreting the durational manipulations in the stimuli as we would expect under normal conditions. We can also note, of course, the continuum is kind of p-biased in the sense that we're getting the bulk of our effect at lower VOT values. Okay, now of course the crucial point of interest here is the interaction of intonation and duration, as I've highlighted. So this will be shown in two distinct plots, each duration condition plotted separately, and within that plot, categorization split by intonation. So looking first here, we have the long condition, and we can see that categorization by intonation is virtually overlapping, reflecting the fact that there's no significant effect whatsoever on categorization in the long condition. This is as was expected. Now we can contrast this with what we see in the short condition. Here, we get a significant effect. You can kind of see visually a small but robust and consistent separation in categorization from about 0 to 30 milliseconds VOT, whereby overall, as you can see, the low-high, short low-high condition has increased P responses relative to the short flat condition. So if we think back to the predictions, an effective intonation was expected in the short condition and found, but the directionality is the inverse of what was originally predicted. So specifically, it was predicted that low-high intonation should decrease P responses, and here we're seeing a significant increase. So on the basis of these slightly unexpected results, I'd like to offer a proposal. This is that intonation itself is relevant to the way that listeners perceive speech rate, and consequently how they categorize speech sounds with a temporal dimension, VOT. So specifically, what I'm suggesting as a possibility is that L-H%, this semi-unambiguous boundary tone, when compressed onto a shorter syllable, is interpreted by listeners as increased speech rate, and subsequent categorization of the target sound shifts accordingly following what we'd expect after an increase in speech rate is perceived. That is a significant increase in this case in P responses. So this account can explain what happened in experiment 1, but it also makes a very specific prediction, which is that we should see the same effect emerge for other durational contrasts, especially those that are not related to initial strengthening. So this is what experiment 2 was designed to test. Another simple forced choice identification task. Listeners here are categorizing a coat-to-code continuum where the duration of the target vowel serves as the cue to the voicing status of the word final stop. Now, this is, of course, a robust pattern in English, a kind of very salient cue to listeners, and it's, of course, also a durational contrast, so it's one that can be influenced by changes in speech rate. And this has been shown before in previous experiments. So, as far as the crucial manipulations here, they were identical to those in experiment 1. Actually, the words "all say" were cross-spliced from the stimuli in experiment 1, of course, recorded at the same intensity by the same speaker, etc., and adjoined to the new target word, plus the word "now" to create the new carrier phrase "all say X now," where X is categorized as coat or code by listeners. As far as the procedure, it was the same as experiment 1 with another 50 participants participating. So, on the basis of experiment 1's results, we can make one very specific prediction. This is that there should be an effective intonation in the short condition only, as in experiment 1, whereby overall low-high intonation significantly increases code responses. So in other words, just as we saw an increase in P responses in experiment 1, if listeners are truly perceiving this as an increase in speech rate, they should modulate the categorization of vowel duration in the same way, such that they require less vowel duration for a code response and effectively, therefore, increase code responses. So also, importantly, this contrast isn't implicated in initial strengthening, so this experiment is a kind of an independent test for the speech rate idea. So, jumping right to the results. Here, again, we have categorization just directly going to the interaction of intonation and duration. So first, at left, categorization in the long condition. Again, you'll note this time in this plot, the y-axis is percent code responses, and the x-axis is the vowel duration values from that vowel duration continuum. So of course we can see as vowel duration increases, listeners are increasing code responses, which is as we'd expect. And in terms of intonation, the lines are again virtually overlapping, reflecting no effect on intonation in the long condition as expected. Now in contrast, in the short condition, we see another significant effect, this time more in the middle region of the continuum, fairly small but robust, and statistically significant, whereby overall low-high intonation is significantly increasing code responses. So this is as predicted. So to summarize, experiment 2 is taken as being fairly analogous to experiment 1 and to potentially suggest that these sorts of intonational manipulations are affecting the perception of temporal contrast more broadly, and of course predicted to generalize to others. Now, one kind of important remaining question here is how listeners are actually interpreting the contours they hear, especially, of course, in the short condition where we're seeing this critical effect. So in other words, are listeners really perceiving some sort of compressed boundary tone or some sort of juncture in the short low-high condition, as I've kind of stipulated? This is kind of work in progress, and I have some preliminary data that addresses this that I'd be happy to discuss during the question period, if there's interest. So the main idea I'm proposing here is that intonational structure might affect the perception of speech rate and consequently the perception of sounds that involve temporal contrasts. Returning to the kind of original question about compensation for initial strengthening, this appears to be one domain where intonational cues are not used by listeners. So this concurs with what Mitter, Cho, and Kim found when following up on Kim and Cho 2013, when they removed intonational cues to boundary and found that their absence versus presence did not alter categorization of VOT. So potentially some converging evidence for this idea. Now, I think these results also make an interesting prediction. This is, if the perception of speech rate is affected by intonational structure and categories, listeners who speak different languages with different categories and intonational systems would be expected to perceive changes in speech rate differently based on these sorts of manipulations. So as one specific example, in Seoul Korean, a similar low-high tune can occur both in IP final and IP medial position, and crucially when medial without any substantial lengthening. So for the reason that it's not kind of distributionally restricted to phrasal edges, we predict that it shouldn't sound sped up to listeners when not lengthened, and therefore in an analogous experiment with analogous stimuli in Seoul Korean and Seoul Korean listeners, we'd expect no effect of intonation. Now, these results also bear on an interesting issue in the speech perception literature, which has to do with the mechanisms underlying rate-dependent speech perception and speech rate normalization. So we know well that speech rate normalization can be domain general, occurring with non-speech stimuli, and there's lots of research showing this. But on the other hand, there's some documented cases of kind of influences in rate-dependent speech perception that seem linked to the language system. So on the one hand, lexical speech rate effects, whereby the presence or absence of a word is perceived on the basis of changes in speech rate. These occur only when the stimuli are intelligible as speech. And there's other cases where orthogonal factors will shift the way that listeners categorize durational contrasts, even when actual contextual segmental durations are controlled. So these can include the phonotactics of a language, whether or not that language is a speaker's first or second language, and also the presence or absence of kind of fast speech processes like reductions. All of these can alter categorization with actual duration, again, held constant. So I think the present study can suggest that we should consider prosodic and intonational systems in this light as well. It's another kind of orthogonal influence on the way that listeners can perceive these durational contrasts. So I think these results are broadly suggestive of the idea that listeners can learn prosodic patterns in rate-dependent speech perception and effectively compensate for that variability. So this is not a new idea. Wade and Holt, for example, say it seems likely that speakers compensate for variability by learning rate-dependent covariance patterns off language input. Now, they didn't have prosody in mind at the time, but I think that logic extends fairly naturally to intonational patterns and prosodic patterns. But I think this, at least from my understanding, this view is kind of currently fairly speculative. And in terms of the present results, this is very much a first step in kind of trying to address this question. So in going forwards, I think important tools for trying to get at this issue more would be using speech or non-speech stimuli to see if their changes reflect different results, maybe suggesting some sort of language specificity. And also, like I suggested, cross-linguistic comparison might be another important tool for kind of looking at how learned language patterns influence this kind of perceptual processing. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
questions from students?
Thank you very much. It's been very interesting. I was wondering if you could follow up, if I could follow up on this. You mentioned that you have some thoughts about whether the listeners actually perceive a boundary there.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how likely it is to have a preserved boundary between the verb and the direct object.
Right.
Especially when the direct object is so short, it's just one syllable.
Yeah, that's a great point. In terms of what we'd expect typically in prosodic phrasing, it's not likely at all. And especially with the stimuli used here, it's a short sentence. I'd be especially interested to compare with the case where it's more natural to have a prosodic break. But yeah, in this case, kind of trying to follow up with the previous study, keeping it short, the idea was just to use kind of acoustic cues to a boundary without worrying too much about whether a boundary should actually be there or not, which of course has its drawbacks. But I do have, if you're interested, a little bit of data asking listeners if they perceive a boundary there. So I can go through this quickly. Here, this is a kind of secret appendix experiment. So listeners, and this is a kind of exploratory follow-up task where they were asked to compare stimuli from the short, low, high, and short, flat conditions where we're seeing this critical effect from both experiments. There's also a third filler, which I won't talk about. But it's kind of just free-form point-and-click 3 alternative force-choice task where they listen to these stimuli by clicking on the sentence buttons that say play sentence 1 and sentence 2, and they're asked in which sentence do you hear a larger break between say and paw, and they make their choice. And we also wanted to give them the option to say same all the time because this is exploratory and maybe there's no difference at all. So that's a setup, and what we see is this. So what you're seeing in these bar plots is just their proportion of different responses when comparing these two stimuli. What this bar plot shows effectively is about 20% of the time they're saying the flat condition sounds like a larger break, 40% of the time they're saying the low-high condition sounds like a larger break, and 40% of the time they're saying that they sound the same. So there's significantly more larger break responses for the low-high condition, but with important caveats like there's a lot of same responses and there's a non-trivial amount of the flat sounds like a larger break, which of course is not expected at all. So I think this, it's kind of offers some tentative support for the idea that listeners are, at least some of them, sometimes interpreting some sort of boundary. Long answer, but yeah.
Other students? Floor is open. Questions?
Yeah, this was a neat experiment, but I'm worried about the interpretation of the results of the second experiment. So it wasn't obvious from the plot that you were getting a boundary shift as opposed to just a steeper rise in the categorization. Did you fit logistic curves in a test separately for boundary shift?
I have not done that yet.
Yeah. You're really expecting a boundary shift, right?
Yeah.
So just an increase in percent P responses from, say, a sharper rise in the categorization function isn't really predicted.
Right, yeah. I was surprised by the way that the effect was kind of localized, and I think you bring up a good point. In terms of testing the significance of the effect at each vowel duration step, I can say it was significant at the 3 steps at 140 milliseconds, 160 milliseconds, where you see that kind of bump, and 180 milliseconds. So it's not strictly localized to that one point, but you're right, there's not much of a horizontal.
So unfortunately, there's not very beautifully logistic written, but I mean, otherwise what would be nice would just fit the logistic regression to the whole continuum, and then ask if the intercept changes and or the slope changes. And the intercept change will tell you where the boundary is.
Right. Yeah, so I have not done that yet, but that's an excellent suggestion. Thank you.
Christian?
I think I have a little bit more of a conceptual question. Where is rate? How are you thinking of rate? Maybe this is sort of like a broad, out there question. But we know that it has this effect on some of the effects that you're talking about. And I'm curious, how are you thinking of how it fits in with the sort of sonic structure?
That's an
as
excellent
a
question.
manipulated feature.
You mean just conceptually where
Yes.
it fits in? Yeah, so I think the view that I'm advocating here, it's always been weird to me to call this rate, since it's looking, at least in these proximal rate effects, we're looking at the duration of something specific and not something rhythmic or over a longer span. But the way that I'm thinking about this is that listeners have sensitivity to the tonal distributions and crucially their distribution over time in the language that they learn. And so kind of messing with that distribution over time influences the way they expect subsequent things to sound. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's sort of a fluid.
Right. Yeah. So this is. I perhaps should have mentioned this is looking at proximal speech rate effects, not kind of global changes in speech rate or changes in rhythmic rate, which is a whole other kind of bag of worms. But yeah, in this particular case, looking at very localized changes in rate, I guess, is what this study was about.
Other questions? Okay, let's thank our speaker and that concludes the